Hello, my name is Gordon Tophom. I'm a Sevier County Commissioner.
And I'm Darin Bushman, I'm Piute County Commissioner.
And we've come in today to talk a little bit about something that both of us are very concerned about. As you watch a lot of the network television programs, you see advertisements about an effort in Utah to regain control of our public lands for beneficial use of the state and the citizens of the state. And some of these advertisements talk about how it's not economically feasible, it's not a good idea, there's a lot of things that aren't a good thing to do on this transfer of public lands. And we wanted to just come in and talk about some of the studies that have been done and let the people make their own decision on whether it's a good thing or not.
Yeah, you know, it's interesting. If you look at some of the ads that are running right now, Southern Utah Wilderness Alliance, you know, calls it a roll of the dice, insanely expensive, significant risk to the taxpayers, and it's all a 30-second soundbite. And as you and I both know, this is an incredibly complex issue. You can't get a feel for this issue in 30 seconds, and those 30-second soundbites are just incredibly misleading.
In 2012, a bill led by, I'm drawing a blank.
Ken Ivory.
By Ken Ivory, House Bill 148 in 2012, proposed and, it was passed into law that the public lands, the federal government lands, be transferred to the state of Utah for management for a lot of good reasons. And I think the governor and the legislature, concerned about whether it's economically feasible, because there were a lot of questions, they passed another bill in 2013. It was House Bill 142, and it authorized one of the state agencies to enter a contract with 3 different universities, Utah State, University of Utah, and Weber State, their economic departments, to go in and look at what this would mean if those public lands were transferred to the state of Utah. And as Darin mentioned, it's very complex. It's 900 pages long, so it's not a little teeny document, and it went into in-depth. The challenge they were given as they were assigned to do this was look at it, look at everything, because if this is not a good idea, not economically feasible for the state, we want to know that. And so they went into that process.
Yeah, the Attorney General's office, Tony Rampton, he's been kind of the lead guy on this. Tony said, his words specifically were, the study is meticulous and scrupulously objective, because the reality of it is they didn't want any outside influence. They wanted real concrete data in the study, and they wanted honest opinions. We're making a pretty major change to policy in the West, and you know, specifically the state of Utah, based upon what comes from this study. So
one of these advertisements that's run by a special interest group talks about that it'll break the state because of the cost of wildfires.
Yeah, the wildfire thing's a really interesting thing. As they looked at the study, including the historical averages and the cost to manage the lands, they come up with a number of $280 million a year. That included a bunch of averages for historical wildfire costs and suppression costs. And the interesting thing about wildfire, and we all should really be concerned about where we are with wildfire. 100 years ago, we didn't have the catastrophic wildfire that we have today. We had wildfire, but it was in small batches. It was small acreage. You know, now we talk a 40,000 acre wildfire is small. You know, so as we're looking at wildfire mitigation costs, last year in the omnibus spending bill, the Forest Service had a huge increase in the dollar amount for fighting catastrophic wildfire. One has to ask the question, why is this happening? Why has it grown to the point that it is? Well, frankly, we've had 100 years of the federal government showing us how they can manage these lands. And we get the results of that every summer. Because what do we do every summer, Gordon?
Fight fires.
We fight fires. We fight catastrophic wildfires. And so I think the federal government has proven to us their ability to manage these lands. I mean, the result comes every summer in the form of wildfire. When we look at that, we're talking massive greenhouse gases. We're talking more pollution than your car. You could drive it for 100 years. Never even come close to the amount of pollution that we're getting from these catastrophic wildfires.
And so, the decaying wood before it burns.
Right. And you know, the thing that that doesn't ever make the news, Gordon, and the part that, frankly, the Forest Service and the federal government wouldn't want you to know is what happens to all the animals that are in these fires, Gordon? Yeah. I mean, some of the bigger animals, they leave. You know, you get a few elk, you get a few, but you know, they had a fire down in Arizona a few years ago, and there's pictures of bighorn elk, 20, 30 dead bighorn elk come out of these wildfires. And guess what? Nothing lives there afterwards. The watershed's destroyed, the habitat's destroyed, and we've seen 100 years of this, right? It's time for us to start managing these lands and manage them effectively. Jan Stambro, one of the professors on the study, as she was doing the study, she said that essentially, if we effectively managed the lands, we harvested the timber, catastrophic wildfire would be greatly reduced. And we know that. It makes sense. When we had an active timber industry, we didn't have this issue.
That's what I wanted to suggest. They've managed it for 100 years, but it's probably been the last 20 to 30 years that, as far as I'm concerned, they've mismanaged it. And I don't want to blame that on any of the local federal employees. I think most of them that have been in the agency a long time are as frustrated as we are with the direction the agencies have gone on what their mission is. Forest Service, for example, used to be sustained yield and to allow harvesting things that could come back again, like the timber, like the grazing, and that sort of thing. But there's been the pushes and pushes from special interest groups that, and all in the guise of this is a good thing to do to eliminate the timber harvest, and it pretty much has happened here in our area. Very few timber contracts go out anymore. And what's happened is the forests have become very, very unhealthy. You know, the natural succession of plants is you start with grasses, eventually you get herbs, and then you go to shrubs, then you go to small trees, then you go to larger trees, then you go to your conifers, and once you're conifers, you're to your pinnacle plant community. And those pretty much stop things from growing under them. So right. If you don't go in and physically remove those, then everything else dies. And when it dies, then you have dead wood for fires. And what we've done is allowed so many trees per acre. A healthy forest, if you're growing timber for harvest, is 40 trees per acre. And as you know, in Piute County, some places you have...
We've got up to 1,000 trees.
Yeah, and we've got up to 500 some places I've looked at. That's not healthy. You can't even, you know, an animal with a big rack of antlers can't even get through some places now that are so thick from this. And they're little trees, and the disease spreads from one tree to another. Around here, it's been the bark beetle can just transfer from one tree to another. They're not healthy. They're wiped out, and so you have a lot of dead trees. Then those dead trees fall down, and nothing can get through those dead trees. When you get a match or something starts the fire, it wipes it out. When you have 40 acres per tree and you get a fire, it'll burn the understory, which comes right back after that. But you need to go in and harvest those trees. Now, if tomorrow we took over the management of the forests, at least as far as timber goes, we've got, I would guess, 20 years. We're going to have to go in and physically cut down the number of trees, get it down to a healthy number of trees, and then allow those to grow till they get to the point that they're harvestable. There's other areas that are harvestable now, but they're in inventoried roadless areas.
Sure.
So we can't get to those.
In a lot of these areas, what's happened is we've let the overpopulation take over so much that what you got is tall spindly trees that are this big around, and you got 1,000 of them per acre. The good news about this, Gordon, is these fires will eventually stop. Right? I mean, we have 97 million acres of national forest, and we're burning up 6 to 7 million acres a year. So eventually,
it'll come back as grassland.
Yeah, it'll stop. We just won't have any watershed, and we don't have any timber. My 10-year-old asked me, he says, "Dad, are there going to be forests left when I'm grown up?" And I said, "Well, at the rate we're going, probably not." I mean, that's kind of where we're headed. So,
and you know, once it becomes grassland, then it becomes those rangelands, and that's another problem that we've got. We have groups that are trying to get cattle off of the public lands, and you can physically manipulate that to keep it at the stage you want it at, but that's very costly. Or you can allow cattle and wildlife to graze, and they'll keep that down. They'll keep away the shrubs. They'll keep it down to this healthy grassland. But if you don't do that, then you've got to physically manipulate it to keep it at that stage, and that's very expensive. So why not allow somebody to make a living off of doing that piece of work for you? So
it's the best fire prevention you can get.
Yeah.
I mean, a cow's mouth eliminates that fuel source in a heartbeat. So definitely. So back to the study. You know, there was the estimated costs were $280 million, and the interesting thing that just frustrates me to no end is some of the headlines read that the transfer of public lands to cost the state of Utah $280 million. Now, if you read that on the surface, you go, geez, why would we do that? It's going to cost the state of Utah $280 million. The part of the story that nobody tells you is that on the extremely conservative side, the net revenues back to the state are $331 million. So, I don't know, the last time I did math, 331 minus 280 was about a $51 million profit. The interesting thing about the study and the meeting we were at,
well, they looked at 9 just different scenarios of how that land would transfer, and the bottom one, the least one,
right,
was a profit of $50 million a year. The top one was $1.3 billion a year. So that, to me, that's a clear-cut, the good thing for the state. And also, you know, you mentioned that they looked at the cost to manage these lands was $280,000. That's what it costs right now for the federal government to manage that. And I've worked for the federal government, I've worked for the state, and I've worked for the county. And it seems like each level you come down, the cost of doing the job goes down. So I think the state could come in and manage that for, I would guess, half what it's costing for the federal government.
Right, and the study looked at it purely as if we took historical averages and current costs, and we compared them and projected that if it was basically, we transferred that organizational structure to the state. We're pretty confident that's not going to happen because we don't want that level of bureaucracy. We don't need that level of bureaucracy. The other thing is you talk to the state representatives that are involved, and Kevin Stratton presented at this meeting. You know, the objective is to bring the counties in to a much higher role in managed lands. And it makes a whole lot of sense to have the counties closer to the people closest to the land doing the management piece. With that, you can't help but see a reduction in the costs to manage the lands. Apache County, Arizona had a big fire, you know about this, and they looked at this and said, what can we do? And they went after mitigation funds. And so they started going out and mitigating and trying to build fire breaks and thin their force and so on and so forth. And what they're finding out is that that mitigation money is substantially cheaper than suppression money. And our own state forester, Brian Cottom, has told us that $1 of mitigation is worth over $500 in suppression money. But where are we spending our money as a federal government right now?
Putting out fires.
We're spending it on big helicopters and big crews, and we're putting out big fires, and we're still burning 6 to 7 million acres a year.
So what do you see as the reason that some of these special interest environmental groups specifically, you know, are, I mean, you and I see how unhealthy our forests are, how unhealthy our rangelands are. Why are they fighting the state taking over the land?
You know, that's a really interesting question, Gordon, and it's, I've asked myself the question, and I've had a lot of people ask me that question. You know, why are these special interest groups so opposed to this? Because they've basically made a business out of suing the federal government for mismanagement. I mean, you can go out and look. There's tons and tons and tons of court case after court case. I mean, when we did the Richfield plan of the BLM, you know, it was very shortly after it was signed, Southern Utah Wilderness Alliance filed a lawsuit. And then Judge Kimball agreed with them on a couple of points. And so threw it back and, you know, basically reverted the plan. We still don't have an answer on what's going to happen. But the reality of it was those special interest groups sue on these plans, and guess what? They get their attorney's fees paid for.
And the way that law is written, too, that if they win one, I mean, if they throw 20 pieces of a lawsuit against the wall and one sticks, the judge agrees with them on one.
Sure.
So they get all of their money back. And when that Equal Access to Justice Act was passed, I think it was a good law. It was meant to help the mom and pop rancher that had a problem with the federal government to go in and sue the federal government, and if and when they win, then they get their fees paid back. And then someone in their eminent wisdom says, well, let's go to nonprofit groups too. because they don't make a profit. Well, most of the nonprofit groups I know seem to find a way to make a profit. And so that's what they do here. Yeah. They end up suing and throw enough stuff against the wall that something's going to stick. And that case that you're talking about was exactly right. 3 of, I think, 12.
3 of 12 points.
Stuck.
And you get your money back. So the interesting thing, and this is just my opinion, but
I think you get more than your money back, because you have activist lawyers that want to help, and they'll do it for a very minimal fee, but then when they make the claim, it's the fee that everybody else gets. So into the coffers of those organizations comes some.
I like to call those, instead of conservation organizations, I like to call those conservation businesses, because the reality of it is they are a business and they're making their money off of the Equal Access to Justice Act. The second way they're making their money is sue and settle. And so if you're the federal government and I'm a conservation business, I sue you, and you, instead of going through the court system and getting into a lot of complicated attorney fees and expenses, I just agree to settle on you, and I make a policy change that makes you happy, and I agree to make some changes, and by the way, those settlements are all quiet, meaning it's pretty hard for you and me to figure out how much money was actually settled upon, right? So there's 2 ways that they're getting their money. Equal access to justice, if they actually go to court and a judge agrees with them on one point, they get their money back. But secondly, there's a lot of sue and settle going on. So why is that important to that question that you asked? Is because I believe, and it's my own personal belief, that if you're a non-profit conservation business and the lands are transferred from the federal government to the state, we don't have an equal access to justice law in the state of Utah. We also know that the state of Utah is willing to stand up and fight when they are sued. I doubt we're going to see the sue and settle scenario that we've seen, transpire with the federal government. So the reason that these organizations are so vehemently opposed to the transfer of public lands is because their funding source goes away, Gordon. That's my belief.
So would all the federal land, I'm asking, I know the answer, but I'm asking you because some of the people we're talking to may not, would all of the federal land be transferred to the state of Utah?
No, that's the interesting thing. A lot of people haven't read, and a lot of these conservation advertisements and their publicity that are putting out, the picture is of Zion National Park, being drilled in, and it's a picture of the Canyonlands, being oil drilling, and so on and so forth. That's not the case, right? So right off the bat, all of the national parks are off the table. National monuments are off the table.
Except one.
Except one, which we believe was illegally done, but
that's the Grand Staircase National Monument.
We have wilderness study areas. Wilderness study areas are up for grab. But the interesting thing about that is the state of Utah in the 2013 legislative session passed the Utah Wilderness Act. So those wilderness study areas will all be evaluated for wilderness. I'm in total agreement. We need to protect the areas that need protected. There are areas that we shouldn't be drilling in, and we shouldn't be, open pit coal mining in, etc. So no, all the lands don't transfer, and even the lands that are transferred are going to be evaluated for protection under the Utah Wilderness Act. So.
Indian land and military land would also be off the table.
Yeah.
That wouldn't come to the state. And the wilderness areas that have been congressionally designated, which there's not an awful lot of those in Utah, those are off the table too.
Right.
We won't go into those. But those wilderness study areas, we will look at and see if they have their wilderness potential. Because that started out at like 1.8 million acres, and then it just grew and grew until I think now it's over 9 million acres. So that's an awful lot, and I'm sure a lot of that doesn't have what you and I and any common sense person would consider wilderness. So.
Yeah, well, a lot of those areas just don't fit the wilderness requirements, the standards. The other thing that comes up in that conversation is that they're going to sell off all the public land, right?
Right.
I mean, I hear it all the time. The state of Utah gets it. They're going to sell off all the public land. They compare it to the School Trust Lands Administration, right? Well, look, the School Trust Lands Administration sold off land, so obviously the state of Utah is going to sell off land. Well, they're two different functions, right? The School Trust Land's in the business of building a trust, putting money into a trust, which then is invested and returns money to the school system in the state of Utah. So if they sell off some land, it's not that it's lost, it's in the trust. The money from that land is in the trust, right? And they sell off very little land, truth be known. But the study that was done and the legislative approach to this is not a single acre was considered for sale. Not one single acre was considered for sale in the study. Yet, special interest groups would have you to believe if we transfer the public lands to Utah, they're going to sell off all the lands and we're going to be drilling here and raping and pillaging the land. And that's not the case. I'm 100% convinced that we're smarter than that in the state of Utah. So.
Well, and there will be areas that are oil and gas rich that for some reason that I don't understand, that these groups have convinced the federal government needed to protect. Some oil leases where you've got wells that have been drilled, and then it's an area right as part of that, and now they can't go back in there and drill where they already have drilled wells. I guess in a way I know how they feel. When I was the park manager at Dead Horse Point, they come in and they wanted to drill out there on that mesa top, and I fought it tooth and nail. I didn't want to see anything there. I lost, and they did drill, and for about 4 months there was a big Christmas tree light out there all the time as the drill well worked. Once they finished, you can't even see where they're at now, and it is a producing well.
Right.
It's producing and going in a pipeline to another area. There's also several other wells down in canyons that are off that mesa that you can't see. So, even though it's happened, it doesn't diminish the experience at Dead Horse Point at all. So, if you manage it right, for some reason, whenever we look at mining or oil and gas, we think of way back in the old days when mining was new and oil was new, and you brought in an oil well and it just gushed all over the ground. The technology is so much different now. We've got oil wells here in Sevier County, and there's, I think, 4 pads up there. And on those 4 pads, there's 27 wells. And you go by them and you don't even know that's what it is. It just looks like a little shed sitting out on a pad.
Right.
And they collect, we haul out of here 6,000 barrels a day of oil out of here. And as you drive by, you wouldn't even know what it was. You thought it might be a farmer's shed.
It's interesting with regard to that. Somehow we seem to think the federal government does a better job at monitoring and managing and oversight of this drilling and whatnot. The interesting thing is there was just a recent study that came out that said the BLM's 9 years behind, something like that, in monitoring these oil wells, right, for environmental regulations. So why would one assume that the federal government can do it better than the state? There's another thing that comes up on this topic a lot. A good friend of mine, hunting and fishing, just lives for hunting, fishing, and recreation, outdoor recreation. I like to get out in the outdoors myself too, but he lives for it. He comes from home with work and he's in the mountains. And he says, I'm not all about that. I'm totally against the transfer of public lands because I don't want it shutting off my access. I don't want it closing down my lands. And what do you think of that?
Well, that's the myth that's out there, that we're going to sell all that land and then they won't have access. I have a daughter that lives in Texas, and when I go down there, I wouldn't want to live there. I mean, you have to get permission to go hunt or even hiking trails and stuff like that. It's just, to me, it's ridiculous. Here, I've grown up with this opportunity, but no, the roads and trails that even have been closed, I think we'll go back in and look at it and see if there's any reason that those can't be reopened again. We have a lot of areas in both your county and my county that's inventoried roadless area on Forest Service lands. That's shut down. That doesn't mean there aren't roads there. There are roads there, but you can't do any work on those roads, and you can't build any more roads without going through a massive process. I think we saw an example of that over in Wayne County last fall. We went on a ride with a bunch of congressional people to show them some of the ridiculous things that the federal government's doing. We went up in an area where there had been a fire 2 years previous, and I'm thinking it was like 2,000 acres that was up there. Big, beautiful ponderosa pine that were burnt. They were dead, but they were still standing there. And on the trail or road that we went in on, within a few feet either side of it, they were marked with blue. And I asked the question, what does that mean? And the Forest Service said that because that's near this road or trail, then we can allow people to go in there, and we've got a timber harvest permit on that. They can go in and take those trees. But right next to that, outside of that area close to the trail, are other gorgeous trees for timber that they can't touch. So it'll just sit there and rot.
Because it's this far away from the limit.
Yeah, so when he got through, and this was a local Forest Service guy, and he agreed this was just stupid. But I said, so because those are close to a road in a roadless area, which means it's probably really not here anyway.
Right.
You can cut it because it's close to this road that shouldn't be here, because it might fall and cause a safety hazard for people on that road that isn't there. But yet, where it's off a ways, just as good a timber, we can't touch that. And that's how silly some of those things get to be.
So I asked my buddy, I said, so have you ever run into a gate? Have you ever run into a closed road or a road that's obliterated as you're out hunting? And he gave me the laundry list, about 1.5 miles long, of all of his favorite places that have been closed, have been obliterated, have been blocked off, trees drug across the road, et cetera, et cetera. I said, by the way, this is the reason for the transfer of public lands, right? This is one of the reasons. We're talking about enhancing access, we're talking about sustainable access, and we're talking about securing it for the future, right? I mean, the reality of it is, our access is being cut off every year. I mean, every year we go out and there's another closed road, and another closed road, and another closed road. Now, I'm not saying we need roads all over the mountain, but the reality of it is, a lot of this stuff, when it's went through the process, even though we've given, you know, page after page after page of rebuttal on these draft plans and travel plans, they fall on deaf ears, right? And so part of the ability to get that closer to the people that are on the ground and people that are local to manage these things is we can secure that access, right? I think we can secure it forever. But the reality of it is, right now, the things that are being done by a bureaucracy 2,500 miles away by people who don't show up on your ballot, Gordon. I mean, the reality is, if you were making that decision and you made those decisions and they didn't like it, what had happened to you in the next election? I mean, you're out of here. You're out of here. You go to our state legislature, if they're doing some stuff that's unacceptable and not environmentally friendly, what do you think is going to happen to that legislature?
You won't go back.
Right. Well, what's your option today? Who do you unelect?
Yeah, and that's a good point. You know, in the state of Utah, I used to work for a state agency, and if there was a law I wanted passed so that we could, something we could enforce in a state park, something that we thought was an issue, I could write the law and then get somebody to sponsor it, but the legislature had to agree with it. Now, if I'm with the federal agency, they pass a law that's usually a good law, and then they turn it over to an agency. They write all the rules to implement that law, and it never has to go back and be approved by anybody.
And if you don't like the rule, who do you appeal it to?
You can't. Well, in some cases you have to appeal it back to the same agency.
Yeah, you appeal it back to the agency that wrote the rule.
So here you've got the rule making, the judiciary of the rule, and the enforcement of the rule that are all the same agency. And when I took civics in junior high, I think there were supposed to be those three separated to check each other out.
Yes.
But we've gone to a point that on some things that it all belongs in that one house.
Right.
And that isn't the case with Utah, so Utah wouldn't have that.
Right.
So the person that comes to me and says, or comes to you and says, so are we still going to be able to hunt and fish and stuff like that? What?
Well, the answer is absolutely. You know, we have over 100 years of using these public lands. We're not transferring these public lands to lock people out of them. I mean, the whole concept of the transfer is to secure that access, right? And we have a huge industry in this state that's built around, you know, sporting and outdoor activities, right? And there's nobody in the state legislature that wants to compromise that. I guarantee it.
And it was a big part of this study. They looked at the amount of money that comes in through hunting and fishing, and even the scenic recreational uses,
right,
and recognize that that's a very valuable component of our economy. We need to stick with that. So I've also heard that this land transfer would help to fund our schools. How does that work?
Well, it's interesting as you look at and you compare the state of Utah to other states that have their lands. North Dakota, good example of this. they're like 4.4, no, they're 2.2 billion above average on spending per pupil, right? And you look at Utah, we're about 2.2 billion below average on spending per pupil. So we got a long ways to catch up, just even to get to average, right? So when you start looking at how do you do that? Well, we could double the taxes in the state of Utah, we wouldn't even come close, right? So right now, there are revenues coming from those lands. Those lands are, there's mineral lease money, there's timber money, there's, you know, grazing fees, there's a number of fees. They're going to the federal government, and the federal government takes out half of it, and then they take out some administrative fees, and then they send it back to the state of Utah. And then if we do sequestration, they steal a little bit of that too. So if you look at it, that money would come back, it would be kept in the state of Utah. We wouldn't be paying the federal government to administer it, for one thing, and we'd be keeping 100% of the money that comes off of those lands.
Well, another thing I don't think a lot of people understand, in the state of Utah, income tax, most cases, all of my income tax is going to go to schools.
Correct.
In some cases, in some places it may be almost all of it, but in most cases it's all of it. And right now we have this program, the federal government program, that's called Secure Rural Schools, where they give us a token amount of money because they no longer generate any money on the public lands. And since they don't have a logging industry and that sort of thing, there's a whole bunch of jobs that don't exist anymore.
Right.
When those used to exist, they paid income tax. That income tax went to the schools. So if we can have a healthy, vibrant economy using our public lands like it used to be, we would have far more money being available to the schools. So that's another area that we help the schools.
The interesting thing about the study is the study, even though it looked at the potential for increasing some of these activities on public lands and, you know, additional mineral usage, et cetera, the study looked at this as if we were stagnant where we are today, you know, as if our oil production stayed stagnant and, you know, our mineral extraction stayed stagnant. Those numbers were evaluated on a level plane. We all believe that there's potential for more of that, right? Because we wouldn't be buried under 17-mile deep bureaucracy to get something done. We all believe that would happen. We also, in the study, very limited amount of money, if any, was taken into account for timber and timber production. And, you know, you go down into Garfield and Kane County, that was a huge industry in that portion of the state. And it's non-existent at this point in time. You know? There
would still be, the state would have a different procedure, but the environmental impact study, before you do anything, you know, the whole idea was originally from the federal government was, before you cut a board, you measure it twice.
Right.
And it's become a way to just stop anything, any boards from being cut.
Right.
Or any development from taking place. So the state of Utah would come up with something that's similar to that, but it wouldn't be nearly as onerous and complex. It would just do that job. Make sure that that what you're going to do is not going to cause major impacts on down the road, and it wouldn't be something that could be used against the agency that's trying to do it. You know, and that's part of the problem I think with the federal government now is because the agency can make these rules, and they do all the time, and they even send out memoranda. For example, the management plan for the Richfield BLM area office lands. There was a memorandum they had on how they were supposed to look at trails and roads related to cultural resources.
Right.
And it was to go to the very highest level of clearance on those. After they got through with doing those 6 that they did in Utah at the same time, they realized how ridiculous that was, that it wasn't needed. So now there's a memorandum that changed that, and now they go back to the lowest level, which is adequate. You know, if it's going to
expanded upon need.
Right. If there's going to be a new trail or road, then you still go to that higher level. But if it's an existing one, you can put it into that. So now anybody that's doing those resource management plans, that's something that's not in what they have to do, but yet we're being held to a higher standard because at that time this was the rule that was in place, and that's one of the things that Judge Kimball ruled against us on.
Yeah, and I mean the reality of it is we're still going to be subject to the clean air, clean water, EPA requirements. Those things are not going to go away, you know, with the transfer of public lands. But certainly permitting and other things that are going on for mineral extraction, those are all going to improve dramatically.
I'm trying to look through my notes here and see if I can find we've covered about everything. We talked about the wilderness study areas.
So one of the things that people like to say, and you see it all the time in these advertisements that are running right now, is that it's clearly unconstitutional.
Yeah.
Right? The transfer of public lands is clearly unconstitutional. Well, the interesting thing about that is it's obviously unconstitutional because it's only been done in every state east of Colorado. And, it was done in Indiana, Missouri, Arkansas, Louisiana, Alabama, Florida, Mississippi, back in the mid-1800s. A guy by the name of Thomas Hart Benton pushed this same rope, right? And had this same argument. And he compelled Congress to honor the promise that they made to the western states to give them their land. And those western states were, Illinois, Indiana, Missouri, Arkansas, right? Florida, the western state of Florida, Mississippi, so it's clearly unconstitutional, right? Because it's already been done.
Well, and then that you also hear, well, the rules changed. The rules changed then but the more recent states don't have that opportunity. But as I remember, Hawaii came into the nation well after Utah did.
That's right.
And they have hardly any public lands there. 97% private lands.
Right.
So somehow it was able to happen. They were able to honor their agreement just like the agreement they had with us there.
So if you look at a map and you look east of Colorado, you see 90+% in every state there. And you look this way and you see 60%. Why the difference? What's the difference, Gordon?
Another question that's a frequently asked question is, does one use of the land override another one? Will there be one that's favored and not another?
Well, that's the interesting thing. If you go back and look even at the federal laws that we have today, they call for multiple use, sustained yield, local planning. I mean, they're supposed to coordinate with the local plans, right? I mean, and it's all about multiple use. But right now, we've gone to a situation, Gordon, where we're basically managing the public lands for litigation avoidance.
Yeah.
I mean, that's what it's really about. And it's on a daily basis. You said it best. The guys on the ground, the local guys that we're dealing with on a daily basis, they're good guys. The reality of it is they're all good guys. But they're also tied into a huge bureaucracy that's holding them down. And they'll tell you point blank. I've had them tell me directly, yeah, it's really stupid, but that's the way we have to do it, right? That's the rules. Yeah, it doesn't make any sense, but that agency 2,500 miles away, that's the way they say we have to do it. So.
The study suggested too that a lot of these federal employees would be absorbed into as state employees.
Correct.
As we take over the management of that. So I think that's
right.
Important for people to understand. Okay, one other thing we probably ought to bring up that the study covered was that there is a major involvement for local governments. That's something we felt like we were always left out on. We're required by federal law to be involved, but as you mentioned earlier, sometimes it's just here's our input and it's nobody
right.
considers it. But this will be the state legislature has a lot of stuff, a lot of laws they're going to have to write. But that is an important component of this study, is that the local counties specifically need to be involved in the process of managing those public lands, which I think is great.
Well, and I think the state legislature realizes this, right? 2013, they created the Stewardship for Public Lands. It's a legislative body, and one of the first things they did was ask us counties to come and give them input. And we were in Midway, Utah. We actually had a day-long meeting up there, and part of that was we were actually on the record talking about all these issues with what our problems are, what our issues are. And you're right, Gordon. The federal agencies are required to coordinate with us, but it doesn't always happen. And even when they do, quote, coordinate, it's kind of like, well, this is what we're going to do. Thanks for your input. So, this is a really complex issue. I mean, the reality of it is we're talking about a really complex issue with a lot of variables. And, they had 18 months to put this study together. We have 30 minutes here to tell you about it. The reality of it is we can't even do that in 30 minutes. There isn't a chance at all that a 30-second commercial that's running on TV can tell you about this transfer. So,
which is what these environmental groups are trying to do.
Right, yeah, they're trying to sway your public opinion with the 30-second spot. The reality of it is the only way you're going to know the real answer to this is to go dig into it, right? We've spent a lot of time, a lot of meetings digging into it. And, the study is very, very complicated, and it's lengthy. It's 800-900 pages. Do yourself a favor. Go look at the study. If all you want to do is read the summary, read the summary. But you can go to publiclands.utah.gov and you can pull up the whole study. It's available for your review. Go ahead and read through it. The summary is pretty short, and it hits all the highlights. And the reality of it is, to fully understand it, you got to read it cover to cover. But the summary is going to give you the majority of the highlights, and take your time to do that. The other resource that's out there, which I think is a great resource, and you can agree or disagree with, the American Lands Council, which has been kind of driving this effort in the state of Utah. AmericanLandsCouncil.org. You can go on the American Lands Council website, and there's presentation after presentation after presentation. There's videos, there's white papers. You can look at the legal studies that have been done that, quote, say it isn't clearly unconstitutional, as a lot of people would have you believe. There was a study done by Professor Cochin, BYU law professor, that says it's not unconstitutional, that we've got a pretty good case for the transfer of public lands. So dig in, take some time, do the research. As a citizen, you might ask, well, what can I do to help? Well, I think the thing you can do is talk to your friends. Have them watch this show. Have them go to the American Lands Council. Go to YouTube. There's a ton of stuff on YouTube from the American Lands Council. Talk to your friends, research it yourself, and best of all, write your representatives. Let your representatives know. Let your local government know. Let our governor know. As a politician, you're kind of out on a limb when you're talking about something this radical. This is a big solution for a big problem. And so, you're always kind of wondering if you're following your constituent base. So, reinforce those people. Reinforce your state representatives. Reinforce your governor's office. And for heck's sake, write your congressman. Write your senator, write your congressman. Let them know how you feel. We believe we spend way too much time trying to dodge federal bullets. I believe that as a county commissioner, I could get a heck of a lot more done if I wasn't spending all my time trying to dodge a federal bullet. Would you agree?
Yeah, it seems like weekly I have to write a response about something that they're trying to do that will affect us in a negative way. And sometimes I forget to write to them when they're doing something that's positive.
Right.
And when you ask for a response and you agree with what they're doing, you need to let them know that too. You mentioned go through this process of learning. I'll tell you, my career was as a park ranger, both for the national park and for the state park system. As this whole idea of the transfer of the public lands came up, I was probably one of the most skeptical people, because I just thought, no, this can't happen. The more I got into it and the more I got involved, I realized this is probably really the only answer. It's the only thing big enough that can make this happen. And I went up in October, and you were there as well, to a meeting with people from 11 states. How many was it? I don't know.
I think it was 11 states.
11 states that met in Salt Lake to come up with a policy statement that says, this is what we want to see happen. Because all of these myths out there about how we're going to take all the land and we're going to sell it, and a lot of the things we've talked about. So we went there and we got to sit down and pound out a policy statement, which I signed. I'm part of that. I agree with it.
Yep.
And as I came back from that, I was re-energized, and I realized that this probably really is the only solution. It's the only thing that's worked in the states west of or east of the Rocky Mountains. It's the only thing that can work in the states west of the Rocky Mountains.
I remember those days when you were a skeptic. I remember that, because I think you and I might have had a few interchanges about it, and you were pretty skeptical. But I think as more data has come on board, and as we've learned more, and we've started to see, the real impact of 100 years of federal management, I call it federal mismanagement, right? we see the results, and the results are every summer we see it in the form of wildfire. So yeah, I totally agree with you. This is probably the only solution that's big enough to get us out of the hole that we're in. Is this a silver bullet? Not in the end. I think we still have a lot of work once this transfer is made. We've got a lot of work. These forests are in bad shape. They really are. They have gotten to the point that they're in bad shape. But I would also say that there's only one direction, and that's up. Right? I think as these improve and we start managing them appropriately, it's going to look good, and we're in good shape.
And you people out there that are watching this, you need to get involved. This is very, very important. There's going to be so much misinformation. A lot of times when, even the American Lands Council, they would be siding on one side of the issue, but this study, and then environmental organizations would be on the other side. This study didn't side on any side of the issue. The direction they were given and the direction they followed was to look at every specific fact in depth. And come back with the truth. And it is the truth. You'll still see some of these organizations that this isn't the truth to them, saying that it isn't true, but it is. It's 3 different Utah universities that took their economic departments and went after finding the truth for what this would mean to Utah to transfer the public lands. They had no agenda in mind as they went into it. They were told to come back with the truth. And when they put the numbers to it, they realized that the best thing to happen would be for the land to be managed closer to the people, which is at the state level.
Well, and I think what you said is really important there. This wasn't just one guy's opinion or one small organization's opinion. This was 3 universities, a fairly large staff of people. They were out interviewing people, they were doing research, they were digging up statistics, they buried themselves in data, they put together a huge economic model that could be managed and manipulated to evaluate various scenarios. And in the end, I believe it is an incredibly objective view of the transfer of public lands. The other thing on that policy statement I think is important. Go to AmericanLandsCouncil.org and you can read the policy statement. Right. That'll tell you exactly what the people who have signed on to that policy statement have signed up to. So with that, go out and share with your friends.